There's a writer that once said, maybe you can explain the statement. He says, where truth is, there is doubt. 'Tis her shadow. Where truth is, there is doubt. 'Tis her shadow. He who never doubted, never half believed. Anyone like to interpret that little mystic poet comments, Brother Wheeler?
Maybe the doubting caused more reason for study, thereby proving that it was the truth.
How'd you get the truth? You doubted, didn't you? There were things you just couldn't swallow in the religion you were in. You had doubts. Is that bad? No, because it caused you, as the brother said, do some reasoning. You see, where doubt is, there is truth. Doubt is like a shadow that follows truth. And he who never doubted maybe never half believed. Never thought enough to ask any question. Now, once you become one of Jehovah's Christian Witnesses, does that change? Do we now become Ottomans? We no longer have an ability to think, or we're not permitted to do any thinking beyond what we see in print? Is it heresy? Is it apostate? Well, I haven't ever felt that in the organization of any of you. No, we're free agents. We were discussing with the elders the other night the scripture, where the Spirit is, there's freedom. So it's very possible some of you, even after becoming one of Jehovah's Witnesses, may be with some doubts on some things. Some of your questions that you handed in indicated maybe some doubts on some things where you accept it for what it is, but you find it hard to understand. Well, is that wrong? What becomes wrong is what Paul mentioned in 2 Timothy. If you'd like to turn there, and then we'll get back into some other verses. 2 Timothy. There was a man in the congregation, and we have these every now and then, like this, 2 Timothy chapter 2, verse 16. It says, "Shun empty speeches that violate what's holy. They'll advance to more and more ungodliness, and their word will spread like gangrene." Hymenaeus and Philetus are of that number. These men have deviated from the truth, saying the resurrection has already occurred, subverting the faith of some. Apparently they were teaching the resurrection occurred when they came from sin and death and received life, and now there'd be no resurrection after that. A very futile teaching. But it's something they got in their head, and what was their problem? They preached it. And it spread like gangrene, and it hurt the faith of other people. So where the error comes is where we campaign for some ideas we might have that aren't really in the Scripture. Any more than maybe some of the things we're fighting against we can't find in black and white. Well, why not just accept what we're taught and not teach what is wrong? We had some disfellowshippings in the area we just came from, 6 of them, either that or reproofs for apostasy. I remember one of the brothers we talked with, well, he had this idea he wanted to talk about. Well, sisters, 4 of them came crying to us about it, weeping. You'd really upset them. Why are you even doing it? Well, it boiled down, he just wanted a little extra attention in the congregation. And he was on shaky ground with the organization. Why do it? Well, Hymenaeus spread his word like gangrene, and sometimes we have to be cautious of the same. What's even more perplexing to myself is how some of us are affected by it at times. Just a couple of things on that. When a person is disfellowshipped for apostasy, a lot in the congregation sometimes get upset. Their faith gets shaken a little bit. And it's so sad because they just don't know all the facts. I'm thinking of those 6 individuals of different congregations in an area we came from before we came here. Oh, they'd found Jesus now. They really understood now what it meant to be born again. Those were the comments, and really some of the friends got really upset over it and nervous. They didn't know that 4 of those 6 were carrying on an immorality and now found a religion that would accept them, immorality and all. You see, what does a person do when they sin and they don't want to change their course? Well, if they're going to live with themselves, they have to attack everybody else but themselves, and that's what they do. They attack the organization, attack the teaching. Now I've found Jesus, and here one of the brothers was living with some woman on the sly. He found Christ now. Why did the brothers let him get them all upset with their faith, and here the man was a reprobate in his current action? Now, we're not saying that everyone who is an apostate is immoral, but we're saying it's very foolhardy for any of you to ever get upset over someone disfellowshipped over apostasy. That is, your faith upset because you do not know the whole story. And perhaps you never will. Maybe only the elders will. Maybe only Jehovah will. But there are many times wicked motivations for seeking fault with teaching. It's not really because they have found now the truth. So if it ever happens, think twice before you let yourself get affected. You don't know their course now. They may have other reasons. And if you know of any persons who have been disfellowshipped in your own areas, you could think and examine their course now and see, are they living a moral life? Chances are, at least generally speaking, the percentages are pretty high. Those persons aren't anymore. They have the truth now, do they? Sat with one sister who was an elder's wife, very upset over the Trinity. The Baptist preacher called her up, and they got talking, and she got upset. She couldn't answer some of the questions. And I asked her, when's the last time you read the whole Watchtower through? Oh, well, it's been some time. Well, has it been a month? Well, no. 6 months? Well, no. Well, she couldn't remember the last time she read the Watchtower through. Yet she was sitting here reading a book published by opposers to the truth, was 360 pages long, and she couldn't read a 32-page Watchtower. What was wrong with her? Why was her faith shaken? Now, the thing we might gather from that, we're not saying it's wrong to read literature published against Jehovah's Witnesses, but it does seem to be a colossal waste of time to read that when you haven't read what is upbuilding and instructive. Something coming from God's channel, and we're not reading it, but we'll read something that's going to corrupt our thinking. Now, there are a lot of us here who have been the truth a number of years. We've gone through the arguments that are popping up now 25, 30, 35 years ago. There's nothing new to us. Some of you who are new, these maybe are new arguments you hear, but they've been around a long time, those arguments. The only difference is maybe you haven't read enough material to fortify yourself, and you should be studying the truth of the matter, rather than us getting upset over what we might classify as the enemy of Christ is publishing. So think about it. James, the first chapter, makes this statement, verse 6. Let him keep on asking in faith, not doubting at all, for he who doubts is like a wave of the sea, driven by the wind and blown about. Every wind of teaching blows us in an indecisive and an unsteady direction. It says, let that man not suppose to receive anything from Jehovah. He's an indecisive man, unsteady in all his ways. Here he's on the shore of hope and then dashed out into the abyss of despair. And some of us are like that because we don't fortify ourselves. We're affected by every wind of teaching. Well, what about the Watchtower, though? Sometimes comes out with material that changes. Isn't that prophesying falsely? Well, it would be if the Watchtower were a prophet, but it's not. That's another thing you'll hear now and then. Person will bring reprints of articles. I remember a young girl brought one to Shirley one time at a door and says, here, look at all these contradictions. And Shirley says, listen, I've been in this longer than you've been alive, and I've seen a lot more than you have there. It hasn't troubled my faith. Why is it upsetting you? Wasn't being sarcastic, just pointing out that sure, things changed in the Watchtower. We don't have to defend it as if it doesn't. I have some reprints that are very interesting. This is from 1884. The Watchtower made this statement under the subject, special light from heaven? No. the Watchtower magazine is not inspired. That's 1884. Here's another one. This one, 1909, September 15th issue. Someone may ask, do you claim infallibility in the Watchtower publications, everything being absolutely correct and never changing? No, we never make such a claim. We're not inspired, was the answer. 1909. 1947 reprint I have here, 1975, on and on. There are all kinds of them where the Watchtower's made the point it's not a prophet. Now, while we may misunderstand, does it prophesy? Well, yes, like you prophesy. You take some prophecy to the door, you've prophesied, but do you utter your own? No. What did Paul say? We use it quite often about the gifts of healing who passed away. What other gift passed? We don't want to forget it. The gift of, or knowledge, it was put. Knowledge being supernatural knowledge from heaven. That passed away in the infancy of the congregation when it grew up. So there may be statements in the Watchtower now and then that change, and we shouldn't be completely surprised by it all. If you turn to Acts chapter 1, no one who reads the Bible should be surprised with any changes of teachings. It's no sign of not being God's servant. Look at the first chapter in Acts. I like to use this quite often with persons because it's Christian history and fact. See chapter 1 that says in verse 6, when they had all assembled, they went to asking him, Master, are you restoring the kingdom to Israel at this time? We said to them, it does not belong to you to get knowledge of the times or seasons. And then in verse 9 says, after he had said these things, while they were looking on, he was lifted up, and a cloud caught him up from their vision, and they were standing gazing into the sky, shocked, dismayed, horrified, not knowing what's happening. And the angel said, why do you men stand looking into the sky? Why were they? What did they tell those 500 people they called there it was going to happen? What did they tell them? Why did they have the group there? The answer really is in the 6th verse. Hey, come on, our Lord's going to establish the kingdom now on earth. They were wrong, weren't they? Were they false prophets? No, that was their understanding. So if we make mistakes today, we're false prophets? No, it's just a wrong understanding, and we're learning. At least we're learning something. I hate being religious teaching the same thing it taught 1,000 years ago, such as the Oriental religions or Christendom. So the light does grow brighter, and sometimes not light growing brighter. It's just that we made a mistake, and we're reversing ourselves now, going back to something we thought one other time. Well, we're not prophets in the sense of the word. But we are with the faithful and discreet slave, because that's where we got the truth. We didn't get it on our own. And those of you who can think back of just learning the Bible, you remember how you knew the Bible before the slaves started teaching us. We knew so little. We attached ourselves with Jehovah's organ of truth, and we've benefited and grown because of it. As far as publications that speak against us, they'll continue. There's not going to be an end to that. Why don't we sue? Well, Pastor Russell was asked that one time. He had a rather unique way of giving an answer to it. Why don't you sue all these organizations who tell lies about you? Brother Russell said, if I stopped to kick every dog barking at my heels, I'd never get to where I'm going. Of course, we wouldn't use that analogy. Maybe today it was a little blunt. But there's no time. We're going to stand around in court for the rest of our life. We have a work to do. Court takes time, expense, litigation. We're not going to be suing persons who publish lies against the organization. Jesus said they're going to hate us, even kill us. What are we going to do about it when they want to kill us? Taking them to court's not going to change things. So we just do the work God has given us and be loyal to the arrangement. As far as those who publish books against us, don't worry about it. Remember one of those books, one of the men wrote, the New York Times says this was written by a man who was mentally unstable. And we got a word from a friend of ours last year, I guess now. Maybe it's longer. But he died in a mental institution now in St. Petersburg, Florida. And the same man was living in adultery. That's why he wrote the book. He was no longer accepted as Jehovah's Witnesses in his marriage arrangement. So you don't know the whole story. You read that, don't get perturbed or upset. There are enemies of Jehovah's Witnesses for a reason. And there again, you get back to an immoral course of life the man wanted to pursue and feel that it was acceptable. Of course, we can't judge him. That's up for God to do. But those are facts. But then, is it wrong? It still doesn't answer to have doubts about some things. Because if the faithful slave was wrong about this, how do we know it might not be wrong about that? Well, it might be one day. But in the meantime, where are all those who quit because they didn't agree? You see them around anymore? Are you bumping into them as you go house to house? No. Jehovah's using a channel and using them to do a work. As far as having doubts, there are proper kinds. If you turn to Luke chapter 24, one of the sisters commented this week, it might matter how we doubt. Well, look at this, Luke 24, just a moment. Luke 24. Jesus appears on the road to his disciples. They didn't recognize him. They thought they were beholding a spirit. So in verse 38, he says to them, "Why are you troubled? Why is it doubts come into your hearts?" Did he scold them? No. He says, "Well, see my hands and my feet. It is I, myself. Feel me, see. Because the spirit does not have flesh and bones, just as you behold that I have." They thinking it was a spirit. And as he showed them his hands and his feet, while they were still not believing for sheer joy, they were wondering, he said to them, "Do you have something there to eat?" They handed him a piece of broiled fish. He took it and ate it before their eyes, giving them ocular, tangible evidence it was him, the risen Christ. He didn't get upset, did he? They had doubts, it said, but he didn't get perturbed. He just gave more evidence. So if you have doubts, it doesn't necessarily mean the teaching is wrong. It might mean you just haven't got enough information on it yet. Maybe you need to study a little more, ask some brothers some of the questions. And then if you don't get the answers, just be patient and wait. Luke, the 11th chapter, shows you, though, the demeanor to maintain in the meantime. And this is what's kept a lot of us faithful to Jehovah and his organization, is not forgetting this. Jesus said in verse 11 of chapter 11, "Which father is there among you who, if his son asks for a fish, will perhaps hand him a serpent instead of a fish? Or he who asks for an egg will hand him a scorpion?" Can you imagine one of Brother Larson's children saying, "Daddy, pass me the fish," and he pulls a rattlesnake out of a bag and gives, well, that's repulsive, absurd. Well, what's the point? Well, God has taught us through his faithful slaves such wonderful things, given us such a wonderful hope. If there are some things you wonder about, remember, your Father's not going to hand you a scorpion or a rattlesnake, a serpent. He's given you bread and meat in due season, and that's never, ever going to change. He's brought us this far through his organization. He'll take us the rest of the way. If you ever have some persons who want to study the matter of how we know this is the faithful slave, we won't go into it now, but you can write it down. 67th Watchtower has 14 questions, and you can ask them to measure them with any religion you want, and they won't find another. We say that arbitrarily. That's 67 Watchtower, page 589. And for your Bible study, it's really a nice thing to sit down and take up with them. Now, there are some of you here that are probably saying, "Well, I don't know what he's talking about because I've never had a doubt since I've become a witness." Well, that's commendable, and it's probably true about some of you here. But not all of us are alike. To illustrate that, how many of you here, when you were children, when your mother and father said do something, you did it without any question? Let's see. Wow, what a group of rebels. Only 4 or 5? We at least have half a congregation once in a while when we have this stuff. Okay, how many of you, when you were asked to do something, didn't do it and wanted to know why you had to do it? Let's see. Oh, I see, almost all of us. Now, is it understandable then why, when we get the truth, some of us, even after years, will say, "Well, why do we believe this?" Or, "I don't understand that." Yet, on the other hand, there are some of us just accept everything, and that's it. There was a man like that in the Bible. He was called Doubting Thomas. Now, that wasn't fair to call him Doubting Thomas. But let's look a little bit into his makeup. Chapter 11 of John will first establish he was not, he didn't deserve the title Doubting Thomas. Jesus was going to Bethany to resurrect Lazarus from the dead. And in the 16th verse, Thomas, who is called the twin, John 11:16, said to his fellow disciples, "Let us also go, that we may die with him." Is that a doubting man? He knew Jesus was almost killed the last time he was there, and he was willing to go and die with him. Now, the other disciples offered. It was Thomas. So, does he really deserve the reputation he has in Christendom? It wouldn't seem so. But there's a reason he's gotten the reputation. It's because of his makeup. Thomas was a deeper thinker, it seemed, than some of the other disciples. If you turn to John, the 14th chapter, was it, when Jesus says, "I'm going to prepare a place for you. All the others are ready to go." But look in verse 5. Thomas, however, says, "Master, we don't know where you're going." All the others are all ready to get up and go with him. But Thomas is the one that thinks the matter out clearly and says, "But where are you going?" See? There's a difference in the man, isn't there? Turn over to the 20th chapter. Here's the famous account. Really, it's beautiful as you think of what transpired here. And you'll find that before some of us say, "Well, see, I'm like a Thomas. I'm a deep thinker." Well, that's not always the best thing. We'll talk more about that in a moment. Let's first read the account. Verse 24 of chapter 20. Thomas, one of the 12, who was called the twin, was not with them when Jesus came. See, Jesus had been put to death. The aid book suggests he could have been frightened, could have been depressed. You know, brilliant people, bright people have a tendency to get depressed much more readily than other persons. See all you brilliant people here saying, "That's me now, I get depressed now." But it's true, people of high intellect sometimes are moodier than other people, get into depths of depression. Next day they're on cloud 9. Maybe Thomas was suffering that, we don't know, but he wasn't there. And what happened? Verse 25, the disciples said to him, "We have seen the Master. He came through the walls." Can you see Thomas? Here they go again, their imagination running off with him. Came through the walls. He says, "Unless I see his hands, the print of the nails, and stick my finger into the print of the nails, stick my hand into his side, I will certainly not believe it." Not doubting Jesus or God, but doubting his brothers. They are excited again. Well, verse 26 says, 8 days later, his disciples were again indoors, and this time Thomas was with them. And Jesus came, although the doors were locked, and he stood in their midst and said, "May you have peace." And then very gently he says to Thomas, "Put your finger here." Uh-oh. What happened? Jesus heard his statement, didn't he? He heard him earlier when he says, "Unless I put my..." Oh, now he says, "All right, Thomas, put your fingers here. See my hands. Take your hand, stick it into my side. But stop being unbelieving. Become believing." In answer, Thomas said to him, "My Master, my God." So overwhelmed. And by the way, it's interesting, Diocletian, the emperor, all the kings in that time were addressed, "My Master and my God." Someone of great power, authority, and royalty. He would have been censured had he thought it was God himself. He knew better than that. He just looked to Jesus as his Master and God. He came through the walls. "I doubted that you had appeared, and here you are." Now, does it say, he says, "Okay, let me stick my finger in"? No. There's no record he did it. That was enough. He saw, he believed. But now look what Jesus said in verse 29. "Because you've seen me, you believed. Happy are those who did not see and yet believed." What a powerful statement. And how that must have dashed Thomas, as verse 31 finishes, Jesus Christ is the Son of God, eliminating any questions, of course, there of eternity. But the point of being a high intellect and thinking deeply and being of an inquisitive nature, that is a nature. But sometimes we want to be careful not to go too far, because being brilliant isn't really always in our favor. It can hold us back. We had a friend, of 50,000 people we served in that district. We looked forward to coming and being with Ed, so we could sit down and discuss spiritual matters, because the man was brilliant. He knew that Bible so well, knew history, but he started asking questions when we'd get together, like, how do we know 607 B.C.? Listen, I've read Ptolemy's Record of the Kings. History doesn't agree with the society. Next time, well, if that isn't true, how about 1914? How do we know that's true? History just doesn't go along with it. Next thing you know, he was out of the truth. He quit. All over that date. Because of his learning, his brilliance. He had the history down pat. You remember what happened about that record of Ptolemy and the King, Scientific American? Was it last October? Came out and exposed that record as a fraud. And we thought, oh my, if we only knew where Ed was now. His whole life, he based on a fraud. See what happens when a man can get to be just too smart for himself. He can set himself up as an authority, even stand against the slave. And look what happens later, history proven wrong. So while we may like to study and we are real students, you're a blessing to the congregation, but don't belittle people who don't. Because that's not always a sign of a strong spiritual man. There are some with very little knowledge much stronger than those with a lot of knowledge. There was a sister in the East Coast. I think it would be easy to get her all confused with questions. I could give her questions she wouldn't be able to answer. If it wouldn't matter, she wouldn't care. All she knows is there's going to be a paradise earth, and that's all that counts to her. And with her little learning, she's the one that's bringing the politicians and the doctors and lawyers and the truth. Nobody else in the congregation can get to them. She does. She has such a strong faith. These other questions on Greek and Hebrew, she couldn't care less. She knows there's going to be a paradise. Shirley and I were meeting for service, like here. This is 1967, 6. Maybe 66. We were in Chicago. And that morning our text dealt with Mordecai. And our question was, why didn't Mordecai bow before Haman? Well, sister in broken English put up her hand and says, Jehovah God says I bow before no man. Well, that wasn't the right answer, was it? So we tried to tactfully point out, well, Daniel bowed before a king. That wasn't wrong then. And so we went a few other examples. But now, remember, Haman was an Amalekite. God cursed the Amalekites. And consequently, when Mordecai came before him, he would not bow, not because he was a prince, but because he was an Amalekite. So, after this 10-minute dissertation, why is it Mordecai didn't bow before Haman? The same sister puts up her hand and says, Jehovah God says, I bow before no man. Well, on the way to the territory, Shirley and I chuckled over that. Not at the sister. We were laughing at ourselves. Because we said, the day may come when we're thrown into a situation where we're going to have to figure out, can we bow or not bow? See, this case they could, this case they couldn't, this man did, this one didn't. Maybe here we can. And we might get mixed up and make a mistake with all our learning. Whereas this sister, she's never going to make a mistake. She's not going to bow before anybody. So having all the answers isn't always a sign of a strong faith. The fact that some of you may not read at all, those of us who do read shouldn't look down on such persons. My father never read a book in his life, but I know a few men who love Jehovah now like he does. He's out shepherding on a Saturday night all by himself. And my mother brought 100 people in the truth. They're good workers, but he's not a learned man. There's some of you here who just don't like to read. But there are some of us who do like to read. Well, good. Let's balance each other out. We're not saying now you don't have to read the Watchtower because I don't like to read. It still does you good to learn about Jehovah. But those of us who do study a lot and read, it doesn't mean We're superior. That's good. Let's just be careful not to get too smart for our own good, because Jehovah hates lofty eyes, the Bible says. What did the early Christians have to read? Nothing. And they faced lions with their children and died faithful. They had nothing to read. It was that abiding hope in the kingdom, the simple truth that kept them loyal. And isn't it, friends, what it all boils down to you? Do you have that unswerving faith in God's kingdom? There are two things you can never doubt. And no matter what questions come to your mind, let's not make excuses and say, well, I'm not preaching anymore because of this, or I'm not staying with the organization because of that. You have two things you can never doubt. One, Jesus said, preach the good news of the kingdom. There's no way to twist that. And you're stuck with it. You read it, you know it's there, and you can't back out of it if you want to live. Leaving the organization, you have no one else to go and preach with. Those are the plain facts. You don't see them anywhere. The other is that you dedicated your life to Jehovah God. Not his organization, Jehovah. But this is where he's worshipped, in this organization. So there's no doubt about those two things. This is where you're going to have to be to preach the good news. This is where you're going to have to be to serve Jehovah, and there's no excuse under the sun to ever leave it and to have God's favor. There's a beautiful, simple faith outlined in Luke 1. Let's turn to it. And this is maybe the way all of us should be, in spirit, demeanor, attitude. Picture yourself, this young girl, maybe 15 at the time, we don't know for sure. Verse 29, verse 28, an angel. He went in before her and said, good day, highly favored one. Jehovah's with you. Well, she was deeply disturbed at the saying. Began to reason, what kind of a greeting would this be? So the angel said to her, have no fear, Mary. Well, how would you feel if an angel suddenly showed up in the room? Wouldn't you be startled? Start thinking of all your sins. What did I do that was wrong? And no wonder the angel had to say, have no fear, Mary. No, have no fear. You found favor with God. I'm not here to annihilate you. Look, you will conceive in your womb and give birth to a son. You are to call his name Jesus. This one will be great. He will become called the Son of the Most High God, and Jehovah God will give him the throne of David his father, and he will be king over the house of Jacob forever. There will be no end to his kingdom. Well, now Mary has some doubt. Would you have doubts if you were suddenly told you're going to conceive? Well, she said, how is this to be? I'm not having relations with a man. The angel said to her, Holy Spirit will come upon you. The power of the Most High will overshadow you. For that reason also what is born will be called holy, God's Son. Well, verse 38, Mary said, look, Jehovah's slave girl. May it take place with me according to your declaration. And the angel departed from her. Did she understand how she was going to become pregnant? She questioned it. The angel said, Holy Spirit will overshadow you. What would that mean to a young Jewess? It would still be a great mystery to her. But that didn't matter. An angel spoke to her. She had a commission from God. And she says, look, I'm Jehovah's slave. I'll do whatever he says. Wouldn't that be a fine attitude for all of us to display? You know, you can develop an attitude of questioning the elders, questioning the circuit overseer, questioning the society. The day may come you won't get any answers. The day may come there'll be nothing in print. The day may come there'll only be orders. Some of your brothers were in the war. If you were told to go out on the battle line, you didn't get to ask why. You'd be shot right on the spot. You know that from World War II, Korean War. The day is going to come when maybe we're under ban and you're only given information and it may seem outlandish to you, but you'll do it if you're wise. Without evidence, without proof, because you'll be like Mary. Look, I'm Jehovah's slave. I'll do anything he wants me to do. His organization's not let me down yet. And this is it. This is the showdown. This is where my faith shows itself. And if you're loyal to God and his organization who's done nothing but serve you, if you knew those brothers back there at headquarters, the hours they keep $20 a month is their pay hike now after $14 for how many decades. Those men get nothing out of this other than service to their God like you're giving service to God. We all stick together, we'll make it. Proverbs chapter 16, there's a beautiful statement we'll conclude with. Be fine to remember it. Happy, chapter 16, verse 20. Happy is the one who is trusting. A beautiful thought. The Hebrew word indicating like a suckling on the breasts of his mother. Happy is the one who is trusting in Jehovah without a shadow of a doubt. It's been a pleasure to share that information with you. We hope it gives you a lot of food for thought.